Hello, good evening, and welcome to this very special evening with Colm Toibin. My name is Caroline Baum. Colm, looking at this beautiful space at full capacity, what do you think that Henry James would make of this?
Henry James appeared in public only once. He was enticed onto the stage on the opening night of his play, Guy Darnville. He didn't know, because he hadn't been at the play, that the audience, or at least the paying members of the audience, had loathed the play and thought it was desperate. And they were really ready for him when he came on. And he was so sure it had been a triumph that he bowed to them. And then when he lifted his head, he realized that they were catcalling, yelling, and abuse. He'd never appeared in public before, and he was in his 50s at this stage. He never did a public reading. And he never really saw anyone reading one of his books. I mean, that sort of relationship that Charles Dickens had with the audience, he didn't have. And Arnold Bennett was there, George Bernard Shaw was in the audience. There are loads of descriptions of that night by all of them, describing how frightened he looked and how horror-struck he was. But then he said something wonderful a few days later. He said, right, now I'm determined. Now will be the time that I'm going to do my best work. You know, that he had in the 2 or 3 days afterwards, he'd become very steely on the subject of that. He would try and achieve more as a result of this very great public defeat. And there was a horrible little Irishman wandering around called Oscar Wilde at the time. And he already had one play on that evening, which at that time, which James had been to that evening. But when James's play was taken off, the producer was looking for a new play by someone new. And Oscar Wilde had a play called, a brand new play, called The Importance of Being Earnest. And so Henry James had to sit in London, sit it out, while Oscar Wilde's second play went on. It was a second roaring success. And, we know what happened next.
Well, I'm interested in that because it seems to me that despite that failure and the humiliation of that night, and the fact that he didn't appear in public at any other time, he was nonetheless, I think, very aware of his own fame. Certainly the way you describe him in The Master, he's aware of when he's being collected and when he's being sort of courted for his celebrity, isn't he? And I read in an interview recently with you that you said that you had sought fame as a writer and that you thought that this was a neurotic impulse. Yeah,
I came across the phrase first in an essay by V.S. Naipaul, who was describing those years, say his own 30s, so the years after Mr. Biz was, and he said in that wonderful accent that V.S. Naipaul had, which is sort of super posh British accent that you can only get if you're an outsider, he said it was during those years that I sought fame as a novelist. And I thought, oh, right, that's what it must be. That's what we must be. That must be what we're doing, seeking fame as a novelist. I thought it was sort of beautiful. Up to then, I thought I was just writing them.
We may get to what your shrink said about that at some later stage in the conversation. I guess, though, it's quite appropriate being in this performance space to talk about what it was like, given what you've just told us about Henry James's disastrous first night. What was the experience like for you of the first night, the opening night of your own play? How does that feeling that you would have had that night compare with, say, the launch of a new book into the world?
I think that I'd invited everyone I knew and loved to my opening night of my play, but I couldn't know and love the third-string theatre critic of the Irish Times. The actual main critic couldn't come. The second critic was a friend of mine, and I said to her, if you think you're reviewing my play... That was a big mistake, by the way. I should have just said, you are coming and you're reviewing... So I got the third one, who obviously didn't like me, my friends, or the play. And, of course, the only thing anyone reads in Ireland is the Irish Times, so that it took us about 2 weeks to gather up strength again to get over I can't remember his name. It's funny, isn't it?
Now, this space is normally used for chamber music. And I was thinking about the way music appears in your work and the way you use music as a conduit into memory. And I was wondering whether you could tell us something about the music that you like and the music that you listen to.
One of the things about a great singer, if you listen to somebody, is the way in which the voice is modulated. In other words, if somebody starts a song, they know at what pitch to begin, and they know at what point to put the emotion in, and they know at what point to build up. That idea of how you handle emotion, that if you go in with all guns blazing at the beginning of a song, you've nowhere to go then, but that you actually begin getting the rhythm right. You actually begin with other things, and then slowly you realize, at this point now, I have sort of won enough with the rhythm to be able to go into a space where I will almost attempt to create pure emotion. I suppose you can do that in prose. It seems to me obvious you can do it in poetry. And in a way, that's what poetry does. But that if you bring that sort of poetry, the poetry that a great singer can bring to a song in a paragraph, or not even in a paragraph, but in a novel itself, where there's one key moment coming and you're building to it slowly, and you're almost trying to win the reader's trust. So the reader will believe that this moment is true, and the reader will actually get it. And what you want almost is that moment where the reader will just simply put down the book for a second and just look in the distance, and so the book becomes an almost shimmering object. And you can get that in song. And if you listen to music carefully enough, or even if you don't listen to it carefully enough, sometimes it comes carefully to you. And you can get that. So that it's one of those funny connections between song and prose.
But in what you've just said, what's interesting is the way you use the word almost, and almost seems to me to be one of your favourite words. In lots of ways, it's about the sort of ambivalence of what is not said, and there's so much of that undertow in your work that leaves us to fill in so many gaps. And I think, again, in another interview that I read with you, you talked about how it's what almost happens to your characters that is far more interesting than what actually happens to them.
Yeah, I found in the Henry James book, for example, that almost sex is more fun sometimes than sex. And therefore, with James, it was the 19th century, he was a very reticent sort of man. I thought, if I gave him loads of almost, moments where there was something like sex, it might have been sex, or it might have become sex, but leave it, don't do it, Elizabeth Bishop has an elegy for Robert Lowell, and she talks about the goldfinches, she says, in this poem, have come back. And then she says, are others like them? And you realize, oh, they didn't come back. And then she says, nature repeats herself, or almost does. And of course, that idea that nature repeats herself, no, it doesn't. Because for us, that we bloom once, and then some other people come, and so that almost becomes the key word there, doesn't it?
It does. We may come back to that. Just staying with the music for one more moment, though, I was wondering whether there's been a change that you've discerned in Ireland since Ireland's kind of prosperity, since riding the Celtic tiger. Have you found that tradition of music making amongst friends and in pubs has been affected, and that people are now staying home and watching television instead?
I know. I wonder about the Celtic tiger as something that happened on the wind, that it was a sort of journalistic invention. But what was happening in people's lives, yes, people had a better time because their children could find work. And there was that confidence that if, Johnny was studying computers, Johnny would end up coming out and working, or Kieran or whoever would end up working for Microsoft, and that would be in Galway or it would be in Kildare. And that made people feel very comfortable indeed. And also I noticed the airport on a Saturday morning in the summer. On Saturday mornings in the summer in Ireland it drizzles. And then the drizzle will eventually become rain. And on Sunday it will spill all day. And that's a nice weekend in July. So the airport, Dublin Airport, on the Saturday morning in July was just so filled with people, so filled with excitement. They were going to Greece. and people with the whitest skin you've ever seen, and their children with red hair and freckles were all ready for Greece, and people began to really know which part of Greece to go to, which were the best bars in Greece. They were, talking about, like they weren't going to drink pints of Guinness or go to Irish bars in Greece, but it was ouzo or whatever, moussaka or whatever. There are crude versions of that, but that in other words, people really enjoyed traveling. People really enjoyed having full employment. But the very funny thing is that when you went to a new play in those years, especially a new play by a young writer, they were the darkest things you'd seen. It was as though the openness of those years allowed people to explore certain things within their families, within their souls, within the society that were hidden, dark, and strange, as almost as though the 1940s erupted on the stage. And if there was a father, he did the most vicious things to his daughter, but that was only the beginning of the play. The second half, he would do the most vicious things to the second daughter. I mean, I'm not making that up. I was at that play. And that in other words, that it didn't actually change anything. And of course, I was too old to change anyway, which is great, which meant that, in other words, you have your friends and you have ways of behaving, and that business of singing, I have friends who are really good singers, and that business of how that would be done certainly didn't change, and how those evenings would be held didn't change at all.
And what about the downturn then? After the so supposedly mythical Celtic tiger, there has been a downturn. So what have you seen happening in Ireland since then?
So terrible vindictiveness. They're blaming the poor bankers, and the thing is, they're right, and it's sort of dreadful. Look, I was sitting in the bar of a hotel, and a famous banker came in, and I really liked him because he gave me a mortgage years ago when he shouldn't have. And I had to sort of come to him personally and say, look, as you know, I have no money. As you know, I'm useless in many ways, but I'd love a mortgage. And he just said, look, I'll fix you up, you'll be fine. I discovered he was charging me a higher rate of interest, actually, later on. But I liked him. And now he came into this place, and he was one of the top bankers who was being blamed for the fall of the banks, for the collapse of people's shares. People had bought shares in the banks. What emerged about him was sort of awful. But he looked afraid. And I didn't like that idea that someone who was a year earlier a leader of the society, profiles of him, describing what an astute businessman he was moving in the streets afraid. And so I did something, I shouldn't have done it, but I went up and I shook his hand. I said, hi, Michael. And he looked at me like really grateful. Someone is shaking my hand. And I thought, yeah, I'm shaking your hand. I just found that area of the way in which individuals have been blamed, rather than, say, the system of regulation. And in an intimate small society like Ireland, where there are really only 4 million people in the Republic, that's a terrible thing, because you see people on the street, you know people's relatives, and that's been the case also with the church. That it's a very intimate society, and people love, seemingly to me, making people into great icons of authority and respectability who are admired hugely, and kicking them. And I just found that slightly ugly. Although, that we should have kicked them, but I still didn't like it, I suppose that one of the reasons I felt that maybe they'd come and kick me next,
I thought I'd heard a story about a bank manager who in fact refused you a mortgage because he was worried that if he gave you a mortgage and you suffered from writer's block, you wouldn't be able to keep up your payments.
Yeah, I got ambitious, and after that first mortgage, which I had paid willingly every month, I wanted a bigger house, and I went to another guy, and he said, head office is a bit worried about you. And I said, okay. I was a bit more solvent at the time, and he said, what? He said, well, we're a bit worried about writer's block. I said, what are you talking about? If you only understood. I had a friend in Ireland, John McGahern, who was a great Irish writer, and John used to love saying, especially if it was the spring, he would love saying, I hope, you know what I'm hoping for? I said, what, John? He said, I'm hoping not to have another idea until after Christmas. And I was saying to the manager, I don't think you understand. I have 100 ideas. I work every day. I'm always writing. Just look at me. And he said, no, but we are a bit worried about this. I mean, I said, what would happen if you broke your leg? He said, well, I'm insured. Are you insured for writer's block? I said, look, there's no such thing as writer's block. There's a well-known thing called writer's laziness. And I don't have it. So just give me the money. But, that's true.
Well, let's just stay with the money for a moment then, Colm, because in fact you made headlines in Britain last year when you said in an interview that you didn't get any pleasure whatsoever from your writing and you only did it for the money. Now, were you being facetious?
Yeah, when Lady Gregory went to America for the first time, and I think it was 1911, she got interviewed all the time, and she wrote to W.E. Yeats and said, when I say pig, it comes out sausage. And, what I actually said, I think this is an important point. I was asked, do you get pleasure from writing? So I thought about it, and I said, no, I don't. That you're working a lot of the time with difficult memory, that you're actually, almost alone as a profession, if it is a profession, but almost alone as an activity where you're mining painful memory, and where you're dealing with things that other people have almost a duty to forget. You actually have a duty to remember, start working with, and almost adding to and seeing how you could put form and substance on them, moving shadow into substance. And with childhood, but with other things too, no matter what happens to you, you end up doing something with it. And that's not natural or normal or good, but you do it. And as you're doing it, you're fiercely concentrating on conjuring it up, putting substance on it, putting form on it and shape. And that's not pleasure. It's just not pleasure. I know what pleasure is. I've had pleasure. And that's not pleasure. It's just not. So the questioner then went on to say, well, did you not get pleasure out of the books being sort of out and when a book comes? No, I don't. No. But success, are you joking? No, I'm just at home. And said, well, did you get any pleasure? I said, yeah, well, I suppose I get it if a check comes. I like the check. If you opened an envelope and suddenly there was a check, that would cheer you up immensely. So that made its way into that I only write for the money.
Okay, well, I'm glad we've got that straight. But let's just
I'm glad I did too, actually, yeah.
With that state of mind that you were describing so beautifully there, because people make much of the fact that your public persona is, as it is, as we see tonight, very gregarious and open, but that there is a tremendous amount of melancholy in your writing. And I remember once talking to Jonathan Franzen and him using this very beautiful phrase to describe the kind of mild depression that he thought that he and many writers suffer from. And he talked about depression being the sponsor of his writing. And I was wondering, is that something that you can relate to?
No, not really. Just simply, I know what pleasure is, as I said, but I've also seen depression in other people, and I don't have it, and I don't suffer from it. But I think it is a funny business. There was a wonderful journalist and novelist in Spain, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, and he wrote a wonderfully hilarious column in the newspapers in Spain, and he wrote really funny books. And I went to see him one day. We were sitting in a bar. God Almighty, he was the most boring. I hope he's not. No, he's dead now, but he couldn't be in the audience. But he was the most turgid person I'd ever met. And he sat looking at me. And every so often I'd say something, and I might try and encourage him to say something more about some joke he'd made, and he just would look at me, and he took a very dim view of everything, and I thought, that's what it is. I get it now. In other words, that when I go home, I get all sad, and when he goes home, he gets all funny. But when I go out... No, but it's true. It's true. And what I'd love to do, and I sought psychiatric help for this, and I have to say the shrink was not helpful, he was bemused about it. I said, look, what I'd love an integrated personality. Could you do that for me? I could every so often maybe write a book that would have some jokes in it and stuff. He said, but you don't want that, do you? And I said, no, I don't. He said, well then, hey, so what's wrong with you? I said, Well, you know. So, you know, in
How
other
much
words...
did you pay for that?
well, you know, quite a lot. But, I mean, it was interesting for him to say to me, but you don't want that, do you? And I say, I thought about it. No, I don't. No.
I'm curious about that because you say that when you go home, again, this is a quote of yours, that when you go home, the humour evaporates on the page. But, for example, in The Master, you are very playful and you have a lot of fun and you create a wonderful sense of mischief around, say, the character of Lady Wolseley and her ridiculous ideas about the relationship between the British and the Irish. There's just a tiny little moment, for example, when she's talking to William James and she says that someone has started learning Celtic. And he says, I think you'll find it's Gaelic. And she says, oh, no, it's Celtic. You know, you have a lot of fun there.
I really enjoy that. And yes, she also says, if only I'd known about it, I would have given parties in it, she says.
Yes.
and she says that you know, it's as old as Greek and Turkish. And also, I mean, it's just that sort of funny thing where Mrs. Keogh in Brooklyn, someone wants her to get a television. It's 1952, I think, and she says, oh, she'd like to get one. A friend of hers had one, but she wondered if they'd keep making programs, and she'd hate having it there in the corner if they'd stopped making programs. You know, and I mean, it's just a funny thing to do. There's another thing. There's an immense chain of grocery stores in Ireland called Dunnes Stores. Everywhere you go, Dunnes Stores, better value, beats them all. It's open 24 hours. There's everything there. But early on, when it's just starting, a woman says, "I don't think that Dunnes Stores will catch on at all." And it's that sort of just trying to play with the future.
So you are funny. You see, you are funny on the page. You just didn't realise it. I noticed that the last two books, Brooklyn and The Master, were both written overseas. They were both written at the Santa Madalena Foundation near Florence, and that place has acquired an incredible reputation and mystique because of the woman who runs the foundation. And I was just wondering whether you could describe the atmosphere and the setup, because I remember reading a piece about it in Vanity Fair once, and it was sort of, you know, pictures of you coming down to breakfast with Zadie Smith and Michael Ondaatje, and this incredibly heady sort of atmosphere. And she seems to me to be someone that Henry James would have absolutely had a meal, you know, he would have had a fine time with her.
Yeah, I mean, someone rang me up and asked me if I would, be interested in going to this place in Italy, and I was thinking about the James book at the time, and so I met Beatrice Rezzori, who's the widow of the writer Gregor von Rezzori, and she asked me if there was anything I needed, you know, while I was there, and I said, "Oh yes, I do. I'd like to meet some posh people, because I'm writing this novel about Henry James, and I'm from a small town in Ireland, and you know, I need to know what they look like, what they sound like, what they're like when they're eating, what they're like, you know, just so I could study them." And so she said, "Oh, I know plenty of posh people, and I'll find them all for you, and they'll all come round. And I mean, I won't tell them what you're doing, and so you can study them away." And I mean, it was extraordinary. I was on my second day there. I mean, I have to say the most frightening thing of all was, I don't know how Zadie Smith felt about this, or Michael Ondaatje, but when I got up to have my breakfast, and there was my breakfast waiting for me, when I went back to my room, I discovered that somebody had made the bed. And they put away my underpants, and they'd generally, you know, if I would have done all that myself if I'd only known. You know, in other words, while I was having my breakfast, a servant came into the room, and, you know, oh, God, anyway, I'm not going to go into detail.
But actually... It gets worse because someone was quoted in that Vanity Fair article as saying that the servant, so-called, came into their room and ironed their underpants.
Yeah, no, she ironed my underpants. Yeah, no, she did, yeah, she did. And, you know, she took a funny look at me later on, I have to say, that servant. But, I mean, the second or third day, Beatrice said, "You know, there's a friend of yours coming." I said, "Who's coming?" She said, "Oh, the Princess Volkonsky is coming." I said, "Princess Volkonsky? Is she?" "Yes, she is. She's the granddaughter of Bolkonsky from Tolstoy, from War and Peace. And she's also the granddaughter of Stolypin, the Russian reformer, and she lives in Rome. She's very nice, and she's coming for lunch." And so she did. She arrived, and she was really terrific. And I had arranged that no matter what I was stuck with the book. It wasn't something from writer's block. I just couldn't think what to put into the book at the beginning. I knew where I was going generally with the novel The Master, but I just needed to start with it. And so I have Henry James being visited by his old friend, the Russian princess. And of course, I was, as she was talking, everything she said, she'd been brought up in Rome because they were exiles, and she was going back to Russia for the first time. So I just took everything she said. I mean, she read the book later on. She didn't seem to mind at all that I had just put her lock, stock, and barrel into the book. And then there were other people came who said things that were slightly secret and strange, and I put those into the book. So it was all terribly useful as an experience, and seeing Italy in that way. That in other words, Henry James lived outside Florence a lot in a place called Bellasguardo, and Beatrice arranged for me to get a cheap rate at the hotel in Bellasguardo. Thank you to the hotel. They put me in a room with no window with a cheap rate. It was nice of them. But nonetheless, I did do that walk back down into Florence and coming up that Henry James did. I began to imagine myself, I'm bald and I'm not fat, but I could be fat. And I began to imagine myself as him. So I was trying to move into that character. And it was very useful being in that atmosphere in Italy, which I certainly couldn't have been in Ireland. We used to have aristocrats in Ireland, but we put them out. And, we don't have them anymore. And, but seeing that a place like Italy still has counts and countesses and baronesses and princesses, and I found all that very useful and helpful. Yeah. It wasn't useful for Brooklyn, by the way.
No, it wasn't.